Hey, amazing people. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy these new 20 Craigslist stories we put together for you. As always, please make sure to like and subscribe if you like what you hear, and please support us. Because of your support, we can keep continuing to provide these great stories for you. Thank you. I had dreamed of owning a sleek, powerful sport bike ever since I was a teenager, ogling over the latest crotch rockets in motorcycle magazines. The aggressive styling and outrageous horsepower figures seemed like something out of a futuristic movie. While my friends were busy getting their driver's licenses for cars, all I could think about was the day I would finally be able to ride one of these machines. As soon as I turned 18, I enrolled in a motorcycle safety course and got my motorcycle endorsement. I started small with an old Honda CB350 twin that I fixed up. It was far from the leader class superbikes I aspired to own, but it gave me a taste of the two-wheeled lifestyle. Over the next few years, I gradually moved up to larger and faster bikes, trading up whenever I could scrape together enough cash. By my mid-20s, I felt confident and experienced enough to finally make the leap to a true supersport. I had my eye on the Honda CBR 600RR, lured in by its iconic styling and strong reputation for being a great all-around sport bike. The inline-4 engine put out around 110 horsepower, which seemed like a rocket ship compared to my smaller bikes. I spent months scoring local classified ads looking for a good use example in my price range. Most were either too expensive or clearly abused and modified. One Saturday morning, I came across a new Craigslist ad that looked promising. It was a 2006 CBR 600R being sold by the original owner with only 9,800 miles on it. The ad said the bike was adult-ridden and never dropped, with oil changes done religiously every 3,000 miles. The pictures showed the iconic red, white, and blue paint scheme that first attracted me to this model years ago. Best of all, the seller was asking just $3,500 due to needing quick cash. It seemed almost too good to be true. I fired off a text to the seller and we arranged to meet that same afternoon so I could check out the bike in person. We met in a grocery store parking lot so I could look it over thoroughly and take it for a test ride. The owner was an older gentleman named Phil who greeted me warmly and immediately started telling me about the bike's history. He purchased it new back in 2006 and had taken meticulous care of it ever since. Phil kept it garaged and rode conservatively, using it for weekend joyrides rather than daily commuting. The bike's condition impressed me. The bodywork still shone with a deep luster and the tires and brakes had plenty of life left. The engine purred smoothly at idle and all the controls worked crisply. Phil's maintenance records showed he performed oil changes, valve adjustments, and other servicing earlier than the manual required. After chatting for almost an hour, he seemed trustworthy and not like someone just trying to offload a problem bike. Eager to finally experience my dream machine, I took the CBR for a quick test ride around the block. The throaty growl of the engine sent tingles down my spine as I twisted the throttle for the first time. The bike felt nimble and smooth through a few corners. The brakes provided strong stopping power when I pulled up back at the parking lot. Convinced this was a solid bike, I paid Phil his full $3,500 asking price in cash and became the proud new owner of a Honda CBR 600RR. I could barely contain my excitement for the ride home along some fun back roads. The inline-4 engine screamed to its 14,000 RPM redline with a mechanical symphony I had long dreamed of hearing. The bike carved through corners with precision as I dragged my knee for the first time. The acceleration was mind-bending coming out of tight turns. I had a huge grin plastered on my face that not even my new helmet could hide. This was everything I had fantasized about and more. But my joyride came to an abrupt halt just as I got up to speed on the highway. The engine's refined purr was interrupted by a sudden violent knocking sound. I pulled over to the shoulder as the noise intensified until the engine cut out completely. Smoke began billowing out from under the fairings. Something was very wrong. Stranded on the side of the road, I immediately called Phil, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation and asking him to bring his truck so we could load up the bike. While waiting for a callback, I've opened up the owner's manual looking for any mention of this issue, but I found nothing about such a sudden engine failure, even under the troubleshooting section. After an hour of waiting by the highway with no response, it became clear I had been scammed. Phil knew the bike had problems and intentionally ignored my calls. With no other options, I called a tow truck to haul me and the broken motorcycle back home. I brought it to a mechanic who quickly confirmed my worst fear. The engine was absolutely destroyed and the bike essentially worthless without a complete rebuild. I was quoted $6,500 for a new engine, almost twice what I originally paid. Over the next few days, I called Phil repeatedly, but he never answered. I left increasingly angry voicemails demanding some kind of refund, but he was costing me completely. I felt like a fool for trusting Phil's word and not getting the bike inspected first. In my excitement, I ignored all warning signs and forked over the cash to a dishonest seller. Now I was stuck with a useless bike that would cost me thousands more to fix than I paid. I had to swallow my pride and sell it at a massive loss just to get some money back. The whole experience left a bitter taste in my mouth that made me wary of buying vehicles on Craigslist again. I learned the hard way that private party sales can be rife with scams. Phil likely knew about the issues but tricked me into thinking it was a well-maintained machine. Someday I may try again to own a sport bike, but I'll be sure to thoroughly inspect it first. My enthusiasm clouded my judgment and I paid dearly for it. Other buyers should heed my warning and protect themselves from shady sellers. Don't let your eagerness take over, or you too may end up with a hole in your wallet and a broken dream. I still can't believe what happened. It all started a few months ago when I was scrolling through Craigslist, looking for some odd jobs to make a little extra cash. Money had been tight lately, and I was behind on my rent and some other bills. I had been picking up shifts at my part-time restaurant job, but I needed something more flexible to really get caught up. That's when I came across a really strange ad that immediately caught my eye. It was posted by someone looking for a volunteer to help them with a special project. The ad didn't go into specifics, but it mentioned that the person would pay handsomely for the help. I was instantly intrigued yet wary. The ad seemed vaguely worded in a way that raised some red flags. But at the same time, I was desperate for cash, so I couldn't stop thinking about it. I debated whether to respond for a few days. The ad could easily have been some kind of scam, but eventually my curiosity and financial situation got the better of me. I figured would lack to lose by at least exchanging a few emails to get more details. So I reached out expressing my interest in learning more about the opportunity. Much to my surprise, the person responded right away. They were very secretive about what exactly they needed help with, but assured me it was legal and that I would be paid $5,000 in cash for just a few hours of my time. That kind of money would have been an absolute game changer. My rent was already 2 months overdue, my car was on the verge of being repossessed, and I had credit card bills piling up. I knew I should have just walked away, but $5,000 felt like a lifeline I couldn't pass up. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet the person at a coffee shop downtown. I barely slept the night before, my mind racing about what I could be getting myself into. But the lure of all that cash kept me from backing out. When I arrived at the coffee shop, I immediately spotted the man who had posted the ad. He looked normal enough, average height and build, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt. He introduced himself as John and shook my hand firmly before sitting down. John was clearly anxious about something. He kept looking around the shop and could hardly sit still as he sipped his coffee. I probably should have picked up on the red flags, but I was laser focused on how $5,000 could get me out of the mess I was in. John explained he needed help with something private at his home outside the city. He assured me it was nothing illegal, just an unusual personal matter he preferred to keep confidential. Against all rational thinking, I agreed to go with him. When we got to his house, my unease only grew. It was an older, rundown home that looked abandoned. John led me through a cluttered kitchen and down some creaky stairs to a basement. It was dimly lit and had a strange, musty odor hanging in the air. Every fiber of my being screamed that I should turn and run, but I convinced myself to gear the man out. That's when John revealed his chilling intentions. He confessed he had spent months looking for someone planning to commit suicide. He wanted me to help find such a person and convince them to come here to end their life. My jaw dropped and my limbs went numb in shock. John quickly explained he would pay the full $5,000 if I located someone suicidal and brought them to his house. He said he needed this to happen within the next couple weeks and would pay half up front. I stood there paralyzed, my mind unable to process what I was hearing. As the initial shock wore off, I became terrified and angry. I demanded John let me out of the basement at once. He refused, saying I knew too much already. Panicked thoughts raced through my mind. Was I in danger? Would this man try to kill me? I assured John I would do as he asked, hoping to calm him down long enough for me to get away. He seemed satisfied and let me leave, reminding me he expected results soon. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. As soon as I got home, I called the police and told them everything. The officer who took my statement seemed skeptical at first, but could hear the terror in my voice. He assured me they would look into it and monitor the situation closely. Over the next week, I checked Craigslist constantly, worried John would harm someone else. Then one night, I spotted a new ad title that made my heart drop into my stomach. Ready for the end. My mind raced, realizing John must have posted it seeking a suicidal person. I immediately called the police officer and told him about the ad. He dispatched a team to John's house right away. When they arrived, he was just letting another man into the basement. Thankfully, the police were able to intervene in time. In searching the house, they uncovered John's horrifying plans. The basement had been soundproofed and converted to a makeshift operating room. There were medical instruments, plastic sheets, and an industrial freezer presumably to store remains. I later found out John had lured several vulnerable people to his home over the past year, though police could not find any remains. He had managed to avoid suspicion until I came forward. Thanks to that timely call, the police were able to stop him before he could claim another victim. I still shudder when I think how close I came to an unimaginable end in that basement. I ignored every warning sign and put myself in harm's way out of sheer desperation. While I'm grateful it didn't turn out worse, I'll never again let financial pressure cloud my judgment like that. I just hope my experience can serve as a warning to others dealing with dire straits. No amount of money is worth risking your life over. I was so excited when I found the rental listing on Craigslist. A beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in the perfect neighborhood for only $800 a month. I couldn't believe my luck. The pictures looked amazing and the landlord said utilities were included. It was way below market rate for the area, but he claimed he just wanted a responsible tenant more than high rent. I contacted him immediately before someone else grabbed it. He said he was renting it himself because his wife had passed away and he didn't want to deal with a property management company. He was currently living out of state but used to live in the apartment. He wanted to rent it furnished as a turnkey unit just as his wife had left it. We exchanged a few emails and he seemed nice and legitimate. He said he just needed first month's rent and a security deposit to take it off the market. This was common practice, so I didn't think much of it. We signed a basic lease agreement online and I sent in the money right away. He offered me a great deal, so I jumped on it. When the move-in date came, I loaded up my things and drove to the address. I was stunned when I arrived. There was a family living in the apartment who had no idea what I was talking about. I showed them my lease and emails from the landlord, but they said they had lived there for 5 years and were the legal owners. It slowly dawned on me that I had been scammed. The man had no relation to the property. He simply found the listing photos online and posed as the owner. I felt so stupid falling for such a scheme, but the price and details had seemed legitimate. I tried contacting him, but of course his phone was disconnected and email bounced back. He had taken my money and disappeared without a trace. I filed a police report, but they said these scams were common and tough to prosecute. I also contacted Craigslist to get the posts removed so no one else was tricked. I was now at $1,600 with no place to live. I scrambled to find a short-term rental while I figured out my next steps. Thankfully, an old coworker had a spare room and let me crash for a few weeks in exchange for helping with groceries. It wasn't ideal, but I was thankful to have somewhere to stay. I berated myself for being so gullible and not seeing the red flags. But the scammer was clearly skilled at gaining people's trust. I decided to channel my anger and focus on recouping the money. I did some research online and found tips for getting scammed funds back. I called my bank and credit card company and contested the charges as fraudulent. They opened investigations but couldn't guarantee I'd get the money back. I also filed a complaint with the FTC and contacted the State Attorney General's office. They tracked these crimes and my report could help build a case to eventually catch the crook. It took over a month of back and forth, but amazingly my credit card company did end up refunding me the $1,600. They said I had a strong case as a scam victim. My bank wasn't able to help since I had willingly sent the wire transfers, but I was thrilled to at least recover the bulk of what I lost. I decided to just move in permanently with my coworker. We got along well as roommates, and splitting costs made way more sense than me getting my own place. And I vowed to never again trust cheap housing offers on the internet. This painful lesson will stay with me forever. The experience shook me, but could have been much worse. With some diligence, I avoided becoming homeless and got my money back. But I pity the next person who falls for that scammer scheme. Hopefully my police report and complaint filings will eventually lead to his arrest before he scams another renter. I learned to listen to my gut and not jump on deals that seemed too good to be true. Even though I recovered financially, the emotional toll of this scam was significant. I became suspicious of everyone, questioning their motives and integrity. I used to believe most people were inherently good, but this experience jaded me. I hated feeling so gullible and ashamed that I was tricked. My friends and family were supportive, reassuring me that the scammer was extremely skilled at manipulation. But I still felt like I should have done more due diligence. I used to be more trusting and open, but now I was wary of even small interactions. It made me sad to lose that optimism and faith in humanity. Beyond my personal trauma, I worried this con artist was still out there preying on other vulnerable people. He had crafted such a believable persona and scheme. I could only imagine how many other victims there were. The police made it clear these cases were very hard to solve, so he likely felt untouchable. I decided to post warnings anywhere I could to try to prevent other people from being scammed. I put up flyers around my neighborhood and shared my experience on community message boards and social media. If I could help even one person avoid this misery, I felt like I was making a small difference. The most troubling part was this criminal faced virtually no consequences. Even if I could help protect others, he would just move on to another scam. Based on the police's statements, he would continue victimizing people indefinitely. The unfairness of that gnawed at me, keeping my resentment simmering. My friends encouraged me to seek counseling to process the violation and anger. I resisted at first, too embarrassed to admit how much this had affected me. After a few months of stewing, I finally made an appointment with a therapist. She assured me these feelings were normal for fraud victims. Talking it through helped release some of the toxic resentment I had been harboring. I realized I couldn't keep judging myself for what happened. The scammer held all the blame. My only responsibility was to heal and become more cautious moving forward. It was a long process, but the self-forgiveness was liberating. While I still felt occasional pains of mistrust, I worked hard to regain my optimism. I didn't want one bad experience to turn me into a cynical, bitter person. My therapist gave me exercises to challenge negative thought patterns and consciously seek out the good. One positive effect was that the experience brought my coworker and I much closer. Our friendship deepened as roommates, and we still live together 2 years later. We built a little family with our rescued pets, which has done wonders for my faith in people. Not everyone is out to scam and hurt you. Though shaken, I refused to let one scammer undermine my entire worldview. I remained wary of Craigslist and other sites, but tried not to let fear control me. Bad people exist, but there is far more good if you open your eyes to it. I focused on surrounding myself with genuine, trustworthy friends and working to help others avoid the mistakes I made. I was so excited when I found that vintage sofa on Craigslist. It looked to be in great condition in the photos, and the dark brown leather would match my living room decor perfectly. The seller said it was an antique passed down in his family. I arranged a time to go check it out and agreed on a price of $300 if I liked it. When I arrived at the seller's house, the sofa looked just as nice as it did in the photos. He said it had been very well cared for over the years. I examined it closely and couldn't find any flaws or smells, so I paid him and brought it home. My husband and I carried the heavy sofa into the living room and positioned it in front of the TV. It looked absolutely perfect there and seemed like just what we needed to complete the room. Over the next few days, I started noticing a faint, musty odor in the living room. At first, I thought maybe it was coming from the rug or something else, but the smell persisted. I began sniffing around the sofa to try to pinpoint the source of the odor. That's when I realized it was definitely emanating from within the sofa itself. The smell was difficult to describe, sort of a combination of mildew, sweat, and something rotten. It was quite off-putting. Upon closer inspection, I noticed some loose stitching along a seam on the back of the sofa. I peeled back the leather to reveal a hidden compartment inside. How strange. No wonder the sofa was so heavy. Inside the secret compartment was a large wooden box. At first I was intrigued, wondering if the seller had forgotten to remove some antique family belongings before selling the sofa. I pulled the box out and examined the intricate carvings on the outside. It was quite beautiful and looked old. I thought perhaps it contained some valuable jewelry or documents. Silly me, I was imagining I just uncovered a forgotten treasure. When I opened the box, I was confused to find another smaller box inside. Why on earth would someone conceal boxes within boxes? The smaller one was plain brown without any markings. I had a feeling of dread come over me, but I slowly opened the second box. Inside was a third small box wrapped in black paper and sealed with tape. My hands shook as I ripped it open. By now it was thoroughly creeped out. What could possibly be hidden under all these boxes? I took a deep breath and opened the third box. I screamed and almost vomited when I saw what was inside. There was a Ziploc bag filled with human feces and maggots writhing around. The stench was overpowering as it had clearly been rotting for a while. I gagged and ran to the bathroom where I became violently ill. Once I composed myself, I rushed back to re-examine the box of contents to be sure of what I had seen. It was even more disgusting and putrid than I remembered. The smell permeated the entire house. I quickly sealed up the boxes and ran outside for fresh air. After the initial shock wore off, I became angry that someone would deliberately conceal such a vile thing inside a sofa. I looked up the seller's information, but he had already blocked me and deleted his Craigslist account. I realized I had been scammed by a very sick individual. I ended up renting a truck to haul the sofa back to the seller's house, but he was long gone. I left that disgusting sofa on the curb with a note warning neighbors about what it contained. Never again will I buy used furniture without thoroughly examining it first. I learned my lesson the hard way. That horrific sofa will forever be etched in my memory. In the following days, I tried various methods to eliminate the lingering stench in my living room. I scrubbed the floorboards, shampooed the carpets, and even repainted the walls. But that foul odor seemed to have seeped into the very fibers of the room. No amount of cleaning products or air fresheners could completely eradicate it. I went to several furniture and home goods stores in search of a new sofa. I was wary of purchasing used again, even though the rational part of me realized what happened was a freak occurrence. I decided to splurge on a quality brand new couch. After an exhaustive search, I finally settled on a soft gray linen sofa from Pottery Barn. The salesperson assured me it was their highest quality material and construction. Delivery was scheduled for the following week. I was counting down the days until my new pristine sofa arrived so I could banish the remaining traces of that disgusting Craigslist couch. Right before the delivery guys came, I gave the living room one final deep clean. The movers hauled the heavy boxes inside and began assembling the new sofa. As soon as they'd peeled back the protective plastic, that familiar rotten stench filled the air. My heart sank. How could this brand new couch possibly smell of just as rancid as the previous one? I watched in horror as the movers pulled back the cushions to reveal a hidden compartment inside this couch as well. I screamed for them to stop as they lifted out a sealed box eerily similar to the first. I was not about to relive that nightmare again. The movers were understandably confused by my extreme reaction. I explained to them what had transpired of the previous sofa as I ushered them outside. They offered to take this couch back and find me another one, but I was done. I told them to just get this thing out of my sight. After they left, I sat on the living room floor and cried, not knowing how I could ever rid myself of this curse. I felt doomed to have the stench of pure evil follow me no matter where I turned. Later that day, I had my husband rip up the carpets while I scrubbed the floor with bleach. Over the next few weeks, we completely renovated the living room down to the studs. I'd given up all hope of ever being comfortable in that space again. Ultimately, we decided the only solution was to sell the house. The tainted memories and associations were too much for me to bear. We listed the property as it is, with the living room gutted and furniture nowhere in sight. I walked to the empty room one last time, still detecting a hint of that wretched smell in the corners. I said a prayer that the next owners would fare better than I had. The house sold quickly, well below our asking price. We moved across town into a new construction home. I took the lesson from those harrowing sofa experiences to heart, and now will only buy brand new furniture from reputable stores. I inspect every inch thoroughly before bringing anything into my home. While I know the statistical chances of encountering another sofa-concealed horror are slim, I don't think I'll ever fully recover from those traumatic events. The paranoia still lingers, and I feel as though I constantly need to be on guard when making any purchase. But above all, I am thankful to be far away from that house and the evil that lurked within. I should have known better. Looking back, the signs were all there, but I was desperate and ignored them. I just needed a ride to get home for the holidays, and Craigslist was my last resort. It was a few days before Christmas, and I had been stranded at the airport for hours after my flight got canceled. I had already spent a small fortune on last-minute plane tickets, and I couldn't afford to book another one. I was exhausted, stressed, and just wanted to be home with my family. That's when I decided to post an ad on Craigslist, hoping someone heading in the same direction might be willing to give me a ride. Within an hour, I got a response from a guy named Mark, who said he was driving from the city to my hometown and had an extra seat available. The price he quoted was more than reasonable, so I quickly accepted. I figured it was worth the risk to avoid the hassle and expense of trying to find another flight. Mark showed up right on time the next morning. He seemed normal enough, a middle-aged guy with graying hair and a friendly demeanor. As I loaded my bag into his car, he made some small talk, asking about my holiday plans. I gave him the basic details, and we were on our way. At first, the drive was uneventful. Mark played some classic rock on the radio, and we made casual conversation about the weather and traffic. But after about an hour on the road, his mood started to shift. He became quieter, his brow furrowed in concentration as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. I noticed him glancing at me in the rearview mirror more frequently, his eyes narrowed. The friendly small talk had dried up, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. I tried to make a few attempts at conversation, but he would only respond with one-word answers. As we passed through a remote wooded area, Mark suddenly slammed on the brakes, causing me to lurch forward. My heart started racing as I wondered what was going on. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. It was clear something was very wrong. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Was he planning to rob me, hurt me, leave me stranded in the middle of nowhere? I gripped the door handle, ready to make a run for it if necessary. Mark took a deep breath and launched into an emotional confession about his life. He told me he had been thinking a lot about the choices he had made and realized he was deeply unhappy. He felt stuck in a dead-end job and a failing marriage. He said he looked at me heading home for the holidays and felt jealous that I had a family and a life, while he had nothing. I shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware of how isolated we were. I told him I was sorry to hear about his problems, but I didn't know how I could help with his personal issues. Mark's expression became wild as he turned to fully face me. He said I couldn't help. No one could. He was a lost cause. He let out a hollow laugh and told me he had been thinking of ending it all, just driving off a cliff to get it over with. My blood ran cold. This man was clearly unstable, and I was trapped in a car with him, miles from anywhere. I needed to get out of this situation immediately. I tried to stay calm and talk him down. I told him I understood he was going through a hard time, but suicide was not the answer. I suggested we just get back on the road and he could drop me off at the next town. I could figure out another way home from there. But Mark refused. He had made up his mind, he said. We were going to finish this trip one way or another. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the full gravity of the situation. This man was suicidal and potentially homicidal. I had to escape before it was too late. Glancing around frantically, I noticed a small pocket knife in the center console. Slowly, I reached for it, keeping my movements discreet. If I could just get it open, maybe I could defend myself or break a window to escape. But before I could grab the knife, Mark suddenly slammed on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward as he announced it was time to end this. I braced for impact, certain he was about to drive off a cliff and kill us both. But instead, he swerved onto a bumpy dirt road, careening recklessly through the trees. I gripped the door handle tightly, trying to brace against the jostling. The car screeched to a halt in the middle of a dense forest. Mark turned to me with a twisted grin, telling me we had arrived. I looked around the isolated woods, my heart pounding. I was completely at this madman's mercy. As Mark stepped out of the car, I knew I had to act immediately. Grabbing the pocket knife, I flicked it open, ready to defend myself by any means necessary. This was my only chance to get away. I took a deep breath to steel my nerves and opened the car door, knife in hand. Mark was pacing by the front of the car, muttering incoherently to himself. I called out shakily, asking him to get back in the car so we could leave. But he whirled around with a blaze in his eyes, insisting it had to end here and now. He began rummaging through the trunk, tossing items aside erratically. My window of opportunity was closing fast. Gripping the knife tightly, I rushed at Mark just as he turned around. Surprise registered on his face for a split second before I slashed his arm and ran into the woods. I heard him yelling after me, but didn't look back. I pushed through the underbrush, ignoring the branches scratching my skin. My lungs burned, but I couldn't stop running. Finally, I slowed to a jog, then a walk, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. Other than forest sounds, all was quiet. It seemed I had managed to escape. But I wasn't safe yet. I had no idea where I was or how to get help. I swore under my breath when I saw my phone had no signal. Of course. The winter sun was already low, meaning it would be dark soon. I knew I needed to find shelter for the night. I also needed to tend to the gash on my leg from falling during my escape. I tied my scarf around it as a bandage. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I remembered everything I could about wilderness survival. Just as the last light faded, I came upon an old ranger station. It was worn down but had 4 walls and a roof. Better yet, the door was unlocked. I scoured the interior and found some supplies, a moth-eaten wool blanket, matches, and a working flashlight. It wasn't much, but it would get me through the night. Exhausted, cold, and shaken, I huddled in the corner wrapped in the blanket. As I finally relaxed, the full trauma of the day's events hit me. Hot tears spilled down my cheeks as I realized how close I had come to death. Somehow, despite the horrors I had endured, I was still alive. Tomorrow I would have to find my way back to civilization. But for now, I was just grateful for the temporary refuge. I said a prayer of thanks as I drifted off, flashlight in hand. It was supposed to be a simple garage sale. I had a bunch of old stuff I needed to get rid of, so I figured I'd post an ad on Craigslist and see if anyone was interested. I didn't expect much, but a few hours after I listed it, people started showing up at my door. The first few customers were pretty normal, just your typical bargain hunters looking for a good deal. They'd browse through my stuff, haggle a bit on the prices, and then be on their way. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then this one guy showed up that really creeped me out. He seemed friendly enough at first, smiling and making small talk as he looked through the items I had for sale. But then he started asking all these personal questions. Where I worked, if I lived alone, stuff like that. I tried to brush it off. Figured he was just making conversation, but there was something about the way he was looking at me that made me really uncomfortable. After a while, he said he was going to think about a few things and left. I was relieved, to be honest. There was just something off about that guy, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I was glad to see him go. A couple hours later, he showed up again. This time, he didn't even bother looking at the stuff for sale. He just walked right up to me and asked if I'd be willing to let him take a look around the house. Said he was interested in maybe buying it. I told him I wasn't selling my house, but he just laughed it off and said he was just curious. Again, I tried to brush it off, but something about the way he was acting just didn't sit right with me. I politely declined his request and he left, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had. The rest of the day went by without incident. A few more people showed up, made their purchases, and left. I was starting to think I was just being paranoid about that one guy. Maybe he was just a little socially awkward, I don't know. But then, as I was getting ready to pack up and call it a day, he showed up again. This time, he wasn't alone. He had 2 other guys with him, and they didn't look friendly at all. They'd barged right into my house, pushing me aside, and started ransacking the place. I tried to stop them, but they overpowered me and tied me up. They spent the next hour or so going through my belongings, taking anything of value they could find. Jewelry, electronics, cash, you name it, they took it. And the whole time, that first guy just stood there, watching with this creepy grin on his face. I begged them to just take what they wanted and leave, but they wouldn't listen. They kept asking me where I kept my most valuable stuff, and when I refused to tell them, they started getting violent. I'll spare you the gory details, but let's just say they made it very clear that they weren't afraid to hurt me if I didn't cooperate. In the end, they took pretty much everything of value in my house and then they left, leaving me tied up and bleeding on the floor. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. I thought for sure they were going to kill me, and the worst part is I can't help but feel like it was all my fault. If I hadn't posted that stupid Craigslist ad, none of this would have happened. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all, to be honest. The police came and took my statement, but they haven't been able to track down the guys who did this. Apparently, they're professionals and they know how to cover their tracks. I'm just grateful to be alive, I guess, but I can't stop thinking about how close I came to losing everything. Those guys knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. It's like they had been playing this for weeks, just waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust anyone again after this. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every little noise, and I can't even bring myself to go back to that house. I've been staying with a friend ever since it happened, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back. I guess the moral of the story is be careful what you post online. You never know who might be watching or what they might be planning. I thought I was just having a simple garage sale, but it turned into a nightmare that I'm still trying to wake up from. I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to fully recover from this, but I'm trying to take it one day at a time. I've got a long road ahead of me, both physically and emotionally, but I'm determined to get through this, and I hope that by sharing my story, I can maybe help someone else avoid a similar fate. So, if you're ever thinking about posting a Craigslist ad, just be careful, okay? You never know who might be out there waiting to take advantage of you. And if you do decide to go through with it, make sure you take all the necessary precautions to keep yourself safe, because you never know when something like this might happen to you. I still have nightmares about that day. I can see their faces, hear their voices. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing. My friend has been great, letting me stay with her and talking me through the panic attacks, but I don't know if I'll ever truly get over this. Part of me wonders if I should have just given them what they wanted. If I had cooperated, would they have left without hurting me? Could I have avoided the violence if I had just told them where my valuables were hidden? But I know that's dangerous thinking. They were criminals who invaded my home and robbed me. Nothing I did or didn't do justified that. I was a victim here, plain and simple. I'm trying not to blame myself, but it's hard. I keep thinking back to that initial encounter with the man at my garage sale. Were there signs I missed? Red flags I should have seen. If I had been more perceptive, could I have realized he was casing the place for a future robbery? My friends tell me not to torture myself with these kinds of questions. What's done is done, they say. All I can do now is try to heal and move forward. And they're right, of course. Dwelling on the past won't change anything. But it's easier said than done. I've always prided myself on being observant and street smart. The fact that I let this happen right under my nose shakes me to my core. How could I have been so blind? I thought I was careful, but clearly I wasn't careful enough. I'd never imagined a simple Craigslist ad could put me in such danger. I took a risk without even realizing it, and I paid the price. I should have known better than to hire a tutor from Craigslist. But when my son Timmy started struggling in math last year, I was desperate to find someone who could help bring his grades up. His teacher said he was falling behind in class and needed some one-on-one tutoring to catch up. I posted an ad on Craigslist looking for an experienced math tutor, figuring I would get more responses and cheaper rates than going through an agency. Within a day, I had dozens of replies in my inbox. I sorted through them, looking for someone local with math qualifications and tutoring experience. One response stood out. A woman named Samantha who said she had a master's degree in education and over 10 years of tutoring experience. She claimed to specialize in helping students who were struggling with foundational math concepts. Her listed rates were very reasonable, and she seemed qualified on paper. Against my better judgment, I decided to give her a try. Samantha arrived promptly at our house for the first tutoring session. She was a tall, thin woman in her mid-30s with long, dark hair and an intense gaze that made me feel slightly unsettled. However, she was polite and friendly, asking questions about what areas Timmy needed the most help with. I explained that he was struggling with fractions and long division. She nodded confidently and said she had a lot of experience tutoring those subjects. Timmy seemed to respond well to her teaching methods, and after the first few sessions, I was cautiously optimistic that this arrangement might work out. Samantha would have Timmy talk through the problems step by step, praising him when he got parts right. She was very patient, never getting frustrated when he made mistakes. Timmy's mood seemed to improve, and he even told me he thought his next math test would go well. However, over the next couple of weeks, I started to notice some strange behaviors from Samantha. She began arriving 10 to 15 minutes early for each session and would wait in her car outside our house. When I asked her about this, she claimed she liked to come early to get focused before the tutoring started. She also started lingering later and later after each session ended. At first, it was just 5 or 10 extra minutes, but soon she was staying almost an hour longer, making small talk and asking questions about our family, Timmy's interests, and my work. Her questions seemed intrusive, like she was digging for information well beyond what she needed to know as his tutor. Then one afternoon I came home early from work and found Samantha alone in the house with Timmy. She claimed that she had arrived early and wasn't home yet, so she let herself in to get set up for the session. But when I asked Timmy about it later, he seemed uncomfortable and said Samantha had been showing him card tricks and telling him weird stories. I felt a knot of worry in my stomach, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Things took an even darker turn a few days later. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard laughter coming from Timmy's room. I went to see what was going on and was shocked to find Samantha sitting on Timmy's bed with him, running her fingers through his hair. Timmy looked very uncomfortable. When he saw me, he quickly got off the bed and left the room. I immediately confronted Samantha, demanding to know what she was doing. She claimed she was just giving Timmy a head massage to comfort him because he had seemed stressed about an upcoming test. But the way she looked at me with that intense, unsettling gaze made my skin crawl. I told her in no uncertain terms that her services were no longer needed and she needed to leave our house at once. Samantha protested loudly, saying it would be damaging for Timmy if she abandoned him right when he was making progress. I stood firm, insisting her behavior was inappropriate and we would find another tutor. She refused to leave at first, pleading with me and insisting she had done nothing wrong. Finally, I had to threaten to call the police to get her to gather her things and leave. I was really shaken up by the whole incident. I knew I needed to take action to keep my family safe. First, I called the police and filed a report about what happened, providing them with Samantha's contact details. The officers were very concerned and said they would look into her background immediately. They also suggested I consider getting a restraining order. I also started doing my own research into Samantha's background. It didn't take long to find out she had lied about having a master's degree or 10 years of tutoring experience. As far as I could tell, she had no qualifications. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere. A few days later, I received a call from the police investigator who had tracked down Samantha. Apparently, she had a long history of suspicious behavior and incidents with other families she had worked for as a tutor or nanny. The police informed me they had arrested her and were working to build a legal case. While I was incredibly relieved Samantha was no longer a threat, the whole traumatic experience took a toll on both me and Timmy. I became hyper-vigilant about monitoring Timmy's interactions with anyone who came to our home. He became much more withdrawn and shy, no longer trusting people as easily as he did before. I tried my best to provide him with extra support and reassurance, but I knew this would leave lasting emotional scars. In retrospect, I made so many mistakes. I never should have hired a stranger from the internet without doing thorough background checks. I should have listened to my instincts when I first felt something was off about Samantha. But at the moment, I was just desperately trying to help my son, and I foolishly let my guard down. It's a mistake I will never make again when it comes to the safety of my family. I share my cautionary tale as a warning to other parents and families. Please learn from my horrible experience. Do not hire tutors or caretakers from online platforms without vetting them thoroughly first. Trust your gut if you feel like something is off with a new person in your home. And act quickly at the first sign of inappropriate behavior to protect your loved ones. The consequences if you don't can be truly unthinkable. I learned this lesson the hard way, but I hope my warning can help prevent the same thing from happening to someone else. I was so excited to go on a 2-week vacation to Europe that I didn't think twice about subletting my apartment on Craigslist. I needed the extra cash to help pay for the trip and figured it was an easy way to make some money while I was gone. Boy, was I wrong. The day I left, I met the guy who would be staying at my place. He seemed nice enough, though a little quiet and awkward, but he had good references and even paid me 6 months' rent up front in cash, so I didn't think much of it. I gave him a quick tour, told him to make himself at home, and off I went on my trip. Those 2 weeks were amazing. I had the time of my life exploring new cities and trying new foods. I didn't think about home much, though I did call to check on my cat a couple times. When I got back to the airport, I was in such high spirits that not even the dreary rain could dampen my mood. That feeling quickly changed when I unlocked my apartment door. The place was completely trashed. Empty beer cans and trash were strewn everywhere. There were suspicious stains on the carpets, and the whole place reeked of cigarette smoke. My TV, laptop, and other valuables were all gone. Even my jewelry and some clothes were missing. I was in total shock. Then I noticed a strange smell coming from the kitchen. When I opened the fridge, I nearly gagged. There was moldy, rotting food that looked like it had been there for weeks. The sink was piled high with dirty dishes caked in old food. Clearly, this guy had been using my place as his own personal party pad. I frantically tried calling and texting him, but got no response. Then I emailed the references he had given me, but those addresses bounced back. I soon realized I'd been duped and didn't even know the real identity of the person who had trashed my home. Over the next few days, I filed a police report and talked to my landlord. The cops said there wasn't much they could do without more information on the guy. My landlord wasn't very sympathetic either, stating it was my responsibility to vet who I sublet to. I also talked to my renter's insurance, but the policy didn't cover this type of incident. While dealing with all this, I tried my best to clean up the mess left in my apartment. I bleached every surface, shampooed the carpets multiple times, and threw out everything in the kitchen. After many trips to the dump, I was able to clear out most of the garbage, but stains and odors still lingered. It was going to take a lot more time and work before my place felt like home again. I was not only violated by the property damage, but also really creeped out. I kept thinking about this stranger who had been living in my space, going through my belongings. Were they dangerous? Would they come back? I hardly slept those first few nights, jolting awake at every little sound. I was constantly anxious, worrying whether my cat or I could be harmed. In the following weeks, I became obsessed with trying to find out the real identity of the Craigslist scammer. I posted warnings online and even tried contacting the police again for updates. But it seemed this person had covered their tracks well. Eventually, I had to accept there was nothing more I could do. The whole ordeal made me lose trust in people. I no longer felt safe in the apartment that had been my happy home for years. I broke my lease early and found a new place, wanting to get a fresh start. But even now, months later, I still get paranoid anytime I use Craigslist or rent my place to strangers. This experience showed me the dark side of people's nature that I thought would never affect me. I learned the hard way to be more careful and vigilant in protecting myself and my home. In the weeks following the incident, I found myself ruminating endlessly about what had happened. No matter how much I tried to think about something else, my mind kept going back to replaying the scene when I first opened my trash apartment door. I'd visualize the mess, the stains, the missing items, and feel a pit in my stomach. It was like I was obsessed over this violation of my space and belongings. Sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep, I find myself digging through old emails and texts, looking for any clues I might have missed about the real identity of the scammer. I knew it was pointless, but I couldn't stop myself from trying to solve this mystery that had turned my life upside down. Who was this person who so easily gained my trust and took advantage of my goodwill? What else were they capable of? Questions raced non-stop through my mind. My friends and family started to notice this unhealthy fixation. They would have to repeat my name multiple times to get my attention because I was so lost in thought. During get-togethers, I would inevitably bring the conversation back around to what happened and my theories about catching the perpetrator. People said I was obsessed and needed to seek counseling to process the trauma and violation. Deep down I knew they were right, but it was easier to stay angry and keep playing detective. Admitting I was the victim of a crime made me feel powerless and ashamed. I blamed myself for not being more careful and wanted to regain control of the situation any way I could. But of course, no amount of rumination would change what happened or get my stolen items back. After a couple months of living like this, consumed by negative thoughts, I decided to take my friend's advice. I found a therapist who specialized in treating anxiety and trauma victims. During our sessions, she helped me realize that by ruminating, I was continuing to give power to the perpetrator. She taught me cognitive and mindfulness techniques to stop unhealthy thought patterns and focus on the present. It wasn't easy at first, but over time I felt the anger and shame subside as I let go of what I couldn't control. I came to accept that I was preyed on by someone with bad intentions, but that it didn't reflect anything about me as a person. The violation shook my faith in others, but I worked hard in therapy to rebuild trust and feel safe in my living space again. My obsession with the crime slowly lifted as I stopped blaming myself and disempowered the faceless scammer. I realized he was likely gone, and focusing on the what-ifs was only hurting me further. I still took reasonable precautions, but refused to be governed by fear and suspicion. Though I sometimes still think back to that traumatic violation of my home, I've made peace with the fact that some questions will remain unanswered. The important thing is I got my life back on track and didn't allow it to be derailed by rumination over what can't be changed. I'm grateful for the support of loved ones who helped me find my way out of the darkness. My horrible experience became a lesson in trust, resilience, and the power we give our thoughts. I should have known better than to hire a random handyman off Craigslist. But when the kitchen sink started leaking and I couldn't get a plumber out for over a week, I was desperate. I posted an ad looking for someone to come take a look, and within an hour, I had a response from a guy named Hank. He said he could come by that afternoon and take care of it for a reasonable price. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Hank showed up right on time, toolbox in hand. He seemed friendly enough, if a bit odd. There was something off about his mannerisms. He had this strange, intense way of looking at me that made me a little uncomfortable. But he got right to work on the sink, and within an hour, he had it fixed up good as new. I paid him the agreed-upon amount, and he left, and I thought that would be the end of it. But over the next few days, Hank started showing up at my house unannounced. At first, it was little things. He'd ring the doorbell and say he was just checking in to make sure the sink was still working okay. I'd politely tell him everything was fine, and he'd leave. But then the visits started becoming more frequent, sometimes multiple times a day. He'd show up with some excuse about needing to take another look or do a follow-up inspection. It was starting to freak me out. I tried to be firm and tell him his services were no longer needed, but he would just give me this unsettling smile and say he was happy to help any time. There was something about the way he said it that sent chills down my spine. I started to get the feeling that he wasn't going to take no for an answer. Things came to a head one night when I was getting ready for bed. I heard a noise downstairs and went to investigate, only to find Hank standing in my kitchen, rummaging through my drawers. When I confronted him, he just gave me that same creepy smile and said he was making sure everything was in order. I ordered him to leave immediately and threatened to call the police if he ever set foot on my property again. Hank left, but the next day he was back, this time parked in a car down the street, just watching my house. I could see him sitting there staring intently. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he had driven off. They said there was nothing they could do unless he actually did something illegal. I was terrified. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, and I made sure to keep all the doors and windows locked at all times. But Hank just kept showing up, sometimes in the middle of the night. I hear a noise and looked out the window to see him lurking in the shadows, just watching. I tried to find ways to deter him. I installed security cameras. I kept the porch light on all night. I even considered getting a dog. But nothing seemed to work. Hank was relentless, and I could feel myself becoming more and more on edge with each passing day. One night, after catching him peering in my windows again, I decided enough was enough. I grabbed my phone and called the police, determined to get him arrested for trespassing and stalking. The dispatcher said a patrol car would be there soon to check it out. I watched from my window as a police cruiser pulled up and 2 officers approached Hank's car. He tried to drive off when he saw them coming, but they blocked him in. They pulled him out of the car, and I could see them questioning him under the streetlight. After several minutes, they put him in handcuffs and led him to the patrol car. I breathed a huge sigh of relief, thinking he was finally going to jail. But to my dismay, they only held Hank for a few hours before letting him go. The police said they gave him a warning about trespassing and harassment, but without evidence of further crimes, Their hands were tied. I was incredulous and scared for my safety. Why wasn't I word enough for them to take real action? Over the next week, Hank's visits became even more frequent, as if he was taunting me now. He knew the police wouldn't do anything unless he actually tried to break in. I was a nervous wreck, barely sleeping at night as I lay in bed listening for any sound of him outside. Finally, I decided I had to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't keep living in fear like this. One night, when I saw Hank's car parked down the street again, I grabbed the baseball bat and went out to confront him. As I approached the car, I could see Hank sitting there, staring straight ahead. I knocked on the window, and he slowly turned to look at me, that same unsettling smile on his face. I demanded that he leave and never come back, and I warned him that I would call the police if he didn't. Hank just sat there, silent for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, he suddenly lunged towards me, his hands outstretched. I swung the bat with all my might, connecting with the side of his head with a sickening thud. Hank crumpled to the ground, motionless. I stood there, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I couldn't believe what I had just done. I quickly called the police and waited for them to arrive, my mind racing. What if he was dead? What if I had just killed someone? The police arrived within minutes and took Hank into custody. Thankfully, he was still alive, though he had a nasty gash on the side of his head. I gave my statement, explaining the situation and how I had felt threatened and acted in self-defense. The police seemed to believe me this time, and they assured me that Hank would be charged with trespassing and harassment. They also said they would increase patrols in my neighborhood to keep an eye on things. As I watched Hank being led away in handcuffs, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The nightmare was finally over, or so I thought. A few weeks later, I started receiving strange phone calls in the middle of the night. It was Hank calling from jail, his voice low and menacing. He told me that he was going to get out soon, and when he did, he was coming for me. He said he was going to make me pay for what I had done to him. I immediately reported the calls to the police, but they said there was little they could do since he was already in custody. They advised me to change my phone number and be vigilant about my home security. Now I find myself constantly on edge, jumping at every little noise and checking the locks on my doors and windows multiple times a day. I can't shake the feeling that Hank is out there, biding his time, waiting for his chance to get back at me. I was so excited when I saw that vintage guitar listed on Craigslist last week. As an amateur musician and collector, I'm always keeping an eye out for good deals on used instruments and gear. The ad said this was a 1960s Fender Stratocaster in excellent condition, with the original case for only $800. That's an incredible price for such an iconic collectible electric guitar. I contacted the seller right away and arranged to meet that same evening at a coffee shop downtown. When I got there, he was already waiting with the guitar case. I inspected the guitar carefully. It looked old but well taken care of, just like the ad described. We did the deal right there. I paid in cash and he signed over the ownership papers. I couldn't believe my luck in scoring my dream guitar for so cheap. Over the next few days, I proudly showed my new vintage Fender to all my friends who are fellow guitarists. We all marveled at what a steal it was. I took it to a local music shop to get it appraised, and they confirmed it was a real 1960s Stratocaster worth around $5,000. I was on cloud 9 and couldn't wait to start using this beauty in my band's next gig. That weekend, I was shocked when a man showed up at my door claiming that I had his stolen guitar. He said he had reported it missing to the police after a storage unit break-in last month. The man was understandably very upset, insisting that the Fender Stratocaster I bought on Craigslist belonged to him. I was so confused and didn't know what to think. I showed him the ownership paperwork I had gotten from the seller. The man said those must be fake documents, and that he still had the original ownership papers with the matching serial numbers. He threatened to get the police involved if I didn't return his rightful property immediately. My mind was spinning with the legal implications here. If this man was telling the truth and could prove he owned the guitar first, I would have to give it back. But I had just paid $800 of my hard-earned money in good faith to the Craigslist seller. What if he was the actual thief, and I was just an innocent victim in all this? Reluctantly, I let the man take the guitar back that day. He provided police reports and his own ownership papers that seemed to check out. Still, I was devastated to lose this rare find and be out $800 with no guitar to show for it. Over the next week, I tried contacting the Craigslist seller several times to explain what happened and ask for my money back. But he never responded to my calls, texts, or emails. His phone went straight to voicemail. The email address he had used was deactivated. It became painfully clear that he had scammed me and disappeared with my $800. I decided to report everything to the police. The questionable Craigslist ad, the meeting where I bought the guitar, and how the original owner had shown up at my door. They were sympathetic, but said this kind of scam happens often on sites like Craigslist. The seller had likely used fake contact info and documents, and was long gone with the cash by now. The police did agree to keep the report on file in case the seller surfaced again locally, but they said chances of tracking him down or getting my money back were very slim. All I could do was chalk it up as an expensive lesson learned about being more cautious when buying from individuals online. I'm still feeling angry and betrayed that someone took advantage of my trust and enthusiasm as a fellow musician, and I'm disappointed in myself for letting excitement over a good deal cloud my judgment. While I'll continue to use Craigslist with greater care, this experience has made me much more wary of potential scams. I just hope no one else gets duped by that con artist and has an unfortunate introduction to the dark side of private online sales. At least I still have my passion for playing music, even if it's now without that dream vintage Stratocaster. In the weeks following this Craigslist nightmare, I found myself obsessing over how I could get some justice. I spent hours combing through old ads on the site trying to find similar listings with the same phone number or email address, anything that could point to the scammer's true identity. I knew the police were unlikely to dedicate significant resources to a crime involving an $800 guitar, but this was the principle. I couldn't let them get away with it. Finally, I found an old ad that looked very similar to the one I responded to, but for a different vintage instrument. The wording was almost identical, as was the contact info. I called the number and a woman answered. I explained what had happened to me and she gasped. The same thing had happened to her husband years ago out of the blue. Someone claimed he was in possession of stolen property and forcibly took back the vintage banjo he paid good money for on Craigslist. The pieces started coming together. This was clearly the work of a serial scammer targeting amateur music collectors through Craigslist ads placed in different cities over many years. I obtained all the details from the woman and her husband to bolster my own police report. Together we could show a pattern of behavior that might help investigators finally identify and prosecute the fraudster. The police were grateful for the new information and said they would reopen the case to actively pursue this Craigslist criminal. Apparently we weren't his only victims. Others had come forward in different jurisdictions after seeing my initial report. I might never get my money back, but at least I could find some comfort in stopping this guy from ruining other people's dreams of finding that perfect vintage instrument. My Craigslist days aren't over, but I will be proceeding with far more caution. I've learned to thoroughly vet sellers, confirm serial numbers, and make exchanges in safe public places. If a deal seems too good to be true, it always is. While I lost a great guitar and $800, I gained something even more valuable: the wisdom to protect myself and others from deceitful predators lurking on sites like Craigslist. My love of music endures, and I won't let one bad experience sour all the great finds still out there waiting for me. Just a bit more carefully this time. Selling that antique dresser on Craigslist opened the door to a harrowing ordeal I never could have imagined. I was moving into a smaller apartment and no longer had room for the ornate oak dresser that had belonged to my grandmother. Though I loved the piece, it made more sense to sell it rather than let it sit in storage. So I posted an ad on Craigslist describing the dresser and included a few photos showing its carved details. Within a day, I received an inquiry from an interested buyer named Mark. He asked logical questions about the dimensions and condition. I confirmed the dresser was in excellent shape with no scratches or watermarks. We arranged a time for him to come view it when I would be home from work. Right away when Mark arrived at my apartment, something about his demeanor put me slightly on edge. He was friendly enough and eager to purchase the dresser, but his enthusiasm bordered on obsessive. He effusively praised the quality craftsmanship, taking measurements and photographs from every angle. I started having second thoughts about the sale, but brushed them off. After inspecting the dresser inside and out, Mark paid full price in cash. The next day, after Mark picked up the dresser, I headed off on a weekend trip and put the whole encounter out of mind. When I returned home, I was surprised to find an elaborate floral bouquet on my doorstep. I asked neighbors if they had seen who left them, but no one had. Unsettled, I brought the flowers inside. Who would leave an anonymous gift like this? Was it some kind of romantic gesture, or was something more sinister at play? My concerns escalated when a few days after the sale, an expensive diamond bracelet arrived in the mail addressed to me. I opened the small box hesitantly, immediately noticing there was no return address. Inside was an unsigned note reading, "Saw this and thought of you." My stomach dropped as I realized this extravagant gift must be from Mark. But how did he get my home address? We had only interacted that one time when I sold him the chair. Over the next few weeks, strange things continued to happen. As I left my apartment building late one night, I noticed a dark sedan with tinted windows parked across the street. The next morning as I walked to work, I realized the same car was following slowly behind me for several blocks before suddenly speeding off. My worst suspicions were confirmed. Mark was stalking me. He somehow knew where I lived and had figured out my daily routine. Soon after, more gifts and cryptic messages started arriving on my doorstep. A beautiful cashmere scarf, an expensive bottle of perfume, poems and letters professing his admiration. Each gift came with an unsigned note referencing some small detail about my life that he could not have known unless he was watching me. I felt sick realizing that Mark had become obsessed and was making sure I knew he had his eye on me at all times. His invasion of my privacy and space left me terrified, wondering what he would do next. I considered going to the police, but worried they would dismiss my concerns since I had no hard evidence. So I continued my regular routine while remaining constantly vigilant. At night, I barely slept, instead looking out the window to see if that car was parked nearby. I varied my schedule and routes so Mark couldn't predict my movements. When I arrived home one evening to find my apartment door unlocked and items subtly rearranged, I knew I was no longer safe there. Mark had been inside and wanted me to know it. I packed a bag to stay with a friend. She encouraged me to take action before things got worse. I installed a security system, changed my locks, and filed a report with the police. Staying off social media and cutting ties with Mark was essential. After 2 agonizing weeks, it seemed Mark had moved on, frustrated by my new hyper-vigilance. I still felt anxious leaving my apartment, but gradually resumed my normal routines. I remained warier of strangers and extra cautious about my security. I also never sold anything online again, unwilling to take a chance of opening my life up to a potential stalker. While I eventually moved on from the trauma of being stalked, it profoundly impacted me. I struggled with anxiety and had trouble trusting people, especially men. For a long time, I looked over my shoulder everywhere I went, half expecting to see Mark lurking nearby. Seeing that dresser posted so innocently on Craigslist unleashed a terrifying chain of events. But I refused to be a victim and let my life be dictated by fear. Mark may have thought he possessed some perverse power over me for a time, but I regained control. Still, I am far more guarded, and it's a constant battle to not let those dark memories encroach on my present happiness. My desperation for a roommate had me ignoring blatant red flags. After losing my job, money was unbearably tight living alone in the city. My Craigslist ad emphasized all the amenities to attract potential roommates. I realized now I should have asked more questions, but the financial stress clouded my judgment. That's how I ended up moving in a complete stranger named Sarah without a proper vetting. At first, Sarah seemed polite and responsible. She had relocated for a nursing job and just needed a room fast. Nothing raised concerns in our initial email exchanges or brief meetup at the apartment. But it wasn't long before peculiarities started emerging, which I purposely overlooked. It began gradually with odd noises late at night, cabinets opening and closing, furniture scraping across floors, faucets turning on and off. When I confronted Sarah, she blamed old pipes and building settlings. I chose to believe her rather than consider the alternative. Then personal items went missing. A sweater, a bottle of perfume, earrings from my jewelry box. At first, just small things I assumed I'd misplaced. But eventually, I found my diary had pages ripped out, which seemed too coincidental. Along with the unsettling signs, someone was going through my belongings. Sarah also took an obsessive interest in my personal life. She constantly questioned me about my job, friends, and family. If I was on the phone, she lingered nearby eavesdropping. She even started showing up places she knew I'd be, saying it was a happy accident. I vilified myself for being too trusting and tried justifying away all the red flags. Admitting I'd made a mistake would mean acknowledging I'd put myself in danger by being so reckless. It was easier to downplay my concerns in the moment. The tipping point came when I caught Sarah crouching outside my bedroom door late one evening. She claimed she thought she heard me cry out, which I knew was a lie. This violation of privacy was too far to ignore anymore. The next morning, I texted Sarah that she needed to move out immediately. This allowed me to have a record of the exchange. As expected, her response was volatile. She refused to leave, called my request ludicrous, and tried to threaten me to retract it. I held firm that for my own well-being, she could no longer live there. I secretly looked into shortening the lease and having her removed, but the complicated legalities had me stalled. For nearly 2 weeks, we lived in tense silence until she finally left. In hindsight, I should have trusted my instincts sooner that something was very wrong. But I let my financial desperation cloud my judgment, and that put me in a dangerous position. I've since learned to be more selective and cautious finding roommates. I ask for references, do a basic background check, and make sure our personalities seem compatible. I won't again ignore red flags or rationalize away creepy behaviors just because someone helps with rent. My ignorant openness left me feeling betrayed and violated. Someone I'd welcomed into my home tried peering into my most private moments, all because I prioritized money over safety. Still, as unsettling as it got, at least nothing seriously bad happened before I removed her from the situation. I count myself lucky that despite ignoring my own uneasy feelings, things didn't escalate further. This experience taught me listening to my instincts is more important than money or convenience. I should have picked up on the signs earlier that Sarah was bizarrely obsessed with me and crossing major boundaries, but desperation blinded me. Now I'm much more vigilant about protecting my home and privacy. I immediately addressed any concerns rather than downplaying them. And I will never again let finances coerce me into a living situation that feels unsafe or invasive. Though I'm still repairing the mess Sarah left behind, each day gets a little easier. Her lingering presence in the apartment has mostly faded, though occasionally I'll find something misplaced and panic she's been here. I think in time those anxieties will subside, but I've definitely learned my lesson. Despite the stress of ultimately having to remove someone from your home, I'm grateful I found the courage to listen to my gut. The situation could have become even more violating and dangerous if I continued to ignore the signs and rationalize Sarah's disturbing behaviors. My home should be a sanctuary, and no amount of financial gain is worth compromising that. I may have learned this lesson the hard way, but it is firmly etched in my mind going forward. From now on, I take responsibility for my living space by screening potential roommates thoroughly and standing firm if I sense that sanctuary being infringed upon. It was an expensive mistake, and one that could have cost me much more. But by reclaiming my home, I took back my power rather than becoming passive in the face of an unsettling situation. And I will never again let desperation blind me to warning signs or silence my instincts. My safety and well-being are simply too valuable. I've always loved collecting antique furniture and decorations, so I often browse Craigslist for interesting finds. A few weeks ago, I was scrolling through the listings during my lunch break when I came across a striking Victorian mirror for sale for only $200. The seller explained in the post that it had belonged to his grandmother, and he believed it dated back to the late 1800s. The photo showed an ornate golden frame with intricate flower and vine detailing carved along the edges. It looked to be in pristine condition. I immediately felt drawn to the gorgeous antique and could envision it hanging in my living room. I responded to the ad right away to express my interest and arrange a time to pick it up. That weekend, I drove out to the seller's home, which was over an hour away in a rural town I'd never been to before. When I arrived, he helped me carefully load the large, heavy mirror into the back seat of my car. Up close, it was even more beautiful than it appeared in the photo. The glass was crystal clear, without a single scratch or fleck of dust. The frame truly was a work of art with its swirling metallic embellishments. I was thrilled to add such a unique showpiece to my collection. On the drive home, I couldn't stop glancing back at it, imagining how perfectly it would accent my living room decor. When I finally hauled the mirror inside and unwrapped it, I spent nearly an hour positioning it in different spots around the living room, turning it this way and that until I found just the right location. I settled on hanging it on the wall opposite my couch so I could admire the ornate frame while relaxing in the evenings. As I stepped back to appreciate how seamlessly it blended with the rest of my antique decor, I noticed something peculiar in the reflection. For just a brief moment, I thought I saw a dark, shadowy figure standing behind me. I whirled around quickly, heart-lurching, but no one was there. My downstairs was completely empty. I laughed at myself for being ridiculous and told myself it must have just been a trick of the light. That night, I had the most vivid, terrifying nightmare I've experienced in years. I was alone, walking through a dark, misty forest when I came upon a tall, antique mirror standing upright in a moonlit clearing. As I cautiously moved closer, a pair of glowing red eyes suddenly appeared in the reflection, and evil, raspy voice told me I would never wake up from this nightmare. I jolted awake in a panic, gasping for air and covered in sweat. My heart was practically pounding out of my chest. I frantically looked over at the new mirror on my wall, but it was just reflecting the same familiar living room. After that dreadful dream, it took me hours to fall back to sleep. In the days following that first unsettling nightmare, I continued having intense, lifelike nightmares involving the antique mirror. I'd see grotesque, shadowy figures moving in the reflection, but whenever I woke up and checked, nothing was there. I also started noticing the mirror seemed to give off a strange coldness whenever I walked past it or stood too close. The disturbing dreams were really starting to take a toll on me. I could barely sleep through the night anymore and felt drained and anxious all day at work. It seemed ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the creeping sensation that something sinister resided within this mirror. I decided to do some research online about the history of antique mirrors and came across many myths and legends about them containing portals to other realms or having the ability to capture and trap souls and energies. I even found some first-hand accounts of people having experiences eerily similar to mine after acquiring an antique mirror. As crazy as it sounded, I couldn't ignore the signs that there was something unusual about this mirror. The more I read, the more creeped out I became. That night, the nightmares were more intense than ever. A mournful, ghostly woman appeared in the mirror, her eyes filled with anguish as she reached out a hand and begged me to help her. I woke up in sheer terror to find my skin ice cold and raised scratches covering my arms. That did it. This mirror had to go immediately. I didn't care if I sounded ridiculous being afraid of an inanimate object. My gut was telling me it was harmful. The next morning, I carefully took the ornate mirror down from the wall, loaded it into my car, and drove it to a donation center across town. I needed to get it as far away from my home as possible. As I pulled away and saw the mirror disappearing from view in my rear view mirror, I felt an immense sense of relief wash over me. Even if it was all in my head, I knew I'd sleep better at night without it in my house. Sure enough, as soon as I got home and settled into bed, I slept deeply and peacefully all night with no creepy dreams. It was the best sleep I'd gotten in weeks. I felt recharged and back to normal in the morning. In retrospect, I learned an important lesson. While I love collecting antiques, some items are better left in the past where they belong. I'll need to be more selective and trust my instincts going forward. If I get a bad vibe from a piece, I won't ignore it like I did with that mirror. Our gut reactions exist for a reason. While most antiques are harmless, every now and then you come across one burdened by a sinister history. After my unsettling experience, I'm in no rush to decorate my home with vintage finds again anytime soon. For now, I'm just grateful to have restful nights and a peaceful home once more. Though it sounds bizarre, I know in my heart that mirror was cursed with some malevolent energy. I'm just relieved I had the foresight to remove it before things got worse. I've sold various household items and electronics on Craigslist over the years without issue, so I didn't have any worries when I decided to post my practically brand new digital SLR camera set for sale at a very reasonable price. In the detailed Craigslist listing, I included specifics about the high-end Canon camera body, extra batteries, charger, a mid-range zoom lens, telephoto lens, wide-angle lens, macro lens, external flash, reflector, multiple memory cards, camera bag, and accessory guidebooks, all in great condition without any signs of heavy use. Within hours of posting the ad, inquiries started rolling in. One potential buyer named Rob seemed very eager, sending me several messages pleading with me to please hold the full camera set until 7 p.m. the next evening when he could meet up by the fountain in the park downtown. He explained he was a dedicated photography student on an extremely tight budget who had been searching everywhere for a good deal on this exact Canon camera model and set of lenses. I felt sympathetic towards his situation as a student and told him I couldn't make any firm promises to hold it if another buyer came along who was ready to pay, but that I would let him know if the set was still available the following day. The next evening, right on schedule, Rob messaged me again confirming he could still meet up and he was on his way to the park. I felt reasonably comfortable with meeting in such a public location, especially since I would be there early in the evening while it was still light out and people were milling around. Though you can never be too cautious when meeting strangers from the internet, I tried convincing myself this was likely just a fellow photography enthusiast excited to score a great used camera set at a steal of a price. Arriving 15 minutes early, I sat on the curved concrete ledge surrounding the large three-tiered fountain and placed the box containing the camera equipment on the ground next to me. Right on time at 7 p.m., a young man who appeared college-age hurried over and tentatively asked if I was the one selling the Canon camera set. When I politely confirmed it was me, he smiled and introduced himself as Rob and eagerly picked up the box to start looking over the contents. He thoroughly inspected the camera body settings, switches, and buttons while attaching and detaching the various lenses one by one. As he diligently examined the lenses, flash, accessories, guidebooks, and everything in the box, I made friendly small talk about photography and asked if he was a student at the local university. Rob responded with short, vague answers, remaining completely absorbed in checking out each item in minute detail. After a couple more minutes, I gently explained that the full asking price we had agreed upon over messaging was $850 based on the value of all the high-quality equipment included. I then politely asked if he wanted to transfer me the money electronically now so we could complete the sale. Without any warning, Rob's entire demeanor abruptly shifted from engaged to enraged. He held tightly to the box with one hand while glaring at me intensely, stating through gritted teeth that he absolutely refused to pay that much. Completely taken aback by his sudden hostile shift in mood, I stood up from the fountain ledge while cautiously replying that the $850 amount was non-negotiable since we had previously agreed to that price via Craigslist messages. Practically shaking with anger now, he insisted that he just knew I was trying to cheat him out of money, and he refused to let that happen or fall for any scam. I'd noticed his free hand was clenched into a tight fist, and he took a menacing step towards me while raising his voice. Trying desperately not to show the panic rapidly building up inside at his dramatic behavior change, I calmly stated we could simply forget this entire arrangement if he was no longer interested in paying the full asking price. I reiterated there was no need for any escalation, and that I would walk away peacefully without the camera gear if he had changed his mind. Shaking his head, Rob shouted that he had to have this specific camera set today, as it was ideal and perfect for his current photography needs. Gently explaining again that wasn't how this transaction worked, I slowly reached my hand out for the box and recommended we part ways if we clearly had different expectations. Without warning, Rob harshly yanked the camera package out of reach and forcefully shoved me in the chest with his other hand, causing me to stumble several steps backwards. Practically screaming now, he declared that if I wanted the equipment back, I would have to fight him for it right here and now because he was not leaving the park empty-handed no matter what. My mind raced with options as I tried to figure out if engaging any further with this clearly unstable and aggressive person was wise, or if I should just let him take the camera gear so I could get away from the situation safely and avoid any physical harm. Before I could fully process those options and decide on a plan, Rob unexpectedly whirled around and started sprinting at full speed across the grassy open area of the darkening park, clutching the box securely under one arm. I initially chased after him for a short distance in the heat of the moment, but quickly realized it was useless as he was much younger and quicker than me. I stopped in my tracks and watched helplessly from afar as the deceitful buyer disappeared into the night with my expensive camera equipment in hand. My hands shaking uncontrollably now from the surge of adrenaline, I slowly turned around and walked back to where my car was parked, replaying the entire event over and over in my mind. I kicked myself repeatedly for not recognizing the blatant red flags and something seeming off about the situation. Once safely inside my vehicle with the doors locked, I took a few deep breaths to calm my nerves before calling the police to file a report, though I knew chances of ever recovering the stolen items were slim to none at this point. In the difficult days and weeks following that traumatic encounter, I became exponentially more cautious if I ever decided to post and sell items through Craigslist again. I would only agree to meet prospective buyers in very busy public areas, started having a friend or family member accompany me for these transactions, and if I got even an inkling that someone might be untrustworthy or trying to scam me, I immediately ceased all contact with them. While getting conned and ripped off by that deceitful con artist was an expensive and painful lesson, I was tremendously relieved to have escaped the alarming, violent encounter physically unharmed. I've always prided myself on being something of a bargain hunter. My friends jokingly call me the coupon queen, but I don't mind. There's just something so satisfying about finding a great deal. So when I came across that Craigslist ad for an antique wooden chest being sold for only $50, I knew I had to check it out. The ad itself was pretty sparse on details, just vintage wooden chest and the price. No photos or description about the condition, which did give me pause. But the bargain lover in me couldn't resist taking a closer look. I messaged the seller and we arranged a time that weekend for me to come see it. That Saturday I drove out to the address, a small house in an older neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The man who answered the door looked to be in his 30s, dressed in jeans and a faded t-shirt. He introduced himself as Mark and led me around to the garage, where the chest was sitting off in a corner. At first glance, it looked like a solid, if unremarkable, antique chest, rectangular in shape, the size of a coffee table made of heavy wooden planks. The dark varnish was cracked and peeling in spots, exposing the weathered wood beneath. The metal hardware was tarnished and rusty looking. Definitely an older piece, though it was impossible to tell its true age. I ran my hand along the edges, inspecting for any major damage or flaws. A few of the boards felt slightly loose, but overall the structural integrity seemed decent. Mark said it had been passed down in his family for years, but he had no real use for it. I asked if he knew any specifics about its origins or history, but he just shrugged. It had been in his grandparents' basement as long as he could remember. After some polite haggling, I was able to talk Mark down to $40. He helped me load the cumbersome chest into the back of my SUV, no small feat given its considerable weight. As I drove home, I felt a thrill of anticipation. While the chest wasn't exactly a rare antique, it still had plenty of vintage appeal. With a little TLC, it could be a great statement piece in my guest room or office. When I got home, I enlisted my husband's help to move the chest inside. We brought it up to the spare bedroom that I planned to turn into a craft room. The musty, dusty smell definitely told me it would need some cleaning. I spent the next hour or so wiping down every surface with Murphy's oil soap, using a toothbrush to scrub the intricate metal etchings. Underneath decades of built-up grime, ornate floral carvings began to emerge. By the time I was done, the wood practically glowed with new life. As I admired my handiwork, I decided to test out the lock and hinges. The key Mark had given me slid easily into the lock, but didn't seem to want to turn. After a few tries, I took a small screwdriver and gave it a few taps. Suddenly, the old mechanism gave way and I heard the satisfying click of the lid unlatching. Eagerly, I lifted the creaky lid to reveal the contents inside, and felt my breath catch in my throat. There, tucked into the corner, were two old-looking weapons caked in dried blood. One appeared to be a large hunting knife with an elaborately carved bone handle. The other was a small hatchet, its dull blade flecked with reddish-brown stains. Shocked, I quickly dropped the lid back down, my mind racing. What were bloody weapons doing inside this unassuming antique chest? My hands shook slightly as the magnitude of the discovery sunk in. I had no idea what to make of it. Should I call the police? Confront Mark about where these came from? Try to scrub the weapons clean? None of those options felt right. After debating it for a while, I decided to just leave the chest alone for the time being. There had to be some harmless explanation, and I didn't want to overreact or get anyone in trouble unnecessarily. Still, over the next few days, I found myself growing more and more uneasy about having those weapons in my home. My imagination kept spiraling with disturbing theories. What if someone had been murdered with them? What if Mark was dangerous? What if the police showed up at my door asking questions? The more I dwelled on it, the more panicked I felt. Finally, I resolved that realistically, there was probably no way these weapons were connected to anything nefarious. They were likely just old relics that had been in Mark's family for ages. Still, it didn't seem right to just keep them. So I decided to take them to the police station and turn them in just to be safe. Surely the authorities were better equipped to handle this properly. The next morning, chest in tow, I drove to the local precinct. I approached the front desk awkwardly and attempted to explain the situation to the officer on duty. He seemed confused at first, but agreed to assign a detective to take my statement. About 10 minutes later, a friendly-looking middle-aged woman in plain clothes introduced herself as Detective Marilyn Simmons. I proceeded to tell Detective Simmons the whole story about finding the chest on Craigslist and discovering the weapons inside. She listened carefully, taking notes and examining the contents herself. I reiterated that I had no idea where the weapons actually came from or what the stains might be. For all I knew, this was one big misunderstanding, but I just wanted to do the responsible thing by reporting it. Death. Simmons said they would log the weapons into evidence and send them to the lab for testing. That made me feel infinitely better. I left the station with a profound sense of relief, confident I had made the right call. Over the next few weeks, I actually forgot all about the strange chest and its eerie contents. I was busy with work, family visits, and getting the house in order for the holidays. It wasn't until early January that I got a call from Detective Simmons with an update. The lab results had come back inconclusive. The stains were indeed blood, but DNA testing could not link it to any known violent crimes. Simmons assured me this was good news, though she admitted the weapon's origins were still shrouded in mystery. While part of me remained curious, I was happy to put the peculiar episode behind me once and for all. I decided the wisest course was to get rid of the chest, free up space, and eliminate any lingering bad vibes. I listed it on Craigslist again, this time disclosing the full story. Surprisingly, I got an immediate response from an antique collector who didn't seem bothered by the macabre backstory at all. I never asked what you wanted with it. Frankly, I was happy to pass the problem along to someone else. In retrospect, the situation makes for a great story at parties. My friends always get wide-eyed when I describe the bloody hatchet and knife tucked away in that inconspicuous chest. They say I should have turned the whole thing into a screenplay. But honestly, I'm content leaving that chapter of my bargain hunting days in the past. The next time I come across a mystery chest on Craigslist, I think I'll just keep on scrolling. Some boxes are better left unopened. It started with a few strange phone calls late one night. The shrill ringing of my phone pierced the silence, startling me awake. Bleary-eyed, I glanced at the clock. 2:37 a.m. Who could be calling at this hour? I debated even answering, but curiosity got the better of me. The first call was static and garbled, with no discernible words. Just heavy breathing punctuated by clicks and whirs in the background. It sounded almost mechanical, not quite human. "Hello," I said, confusion evident in my voice. But the only response was a long sigh, and silence as the line went dead. Perplexed, I tried to shrug it off as a wrong number and went back to sleep. But the calls persisted over the next week, always from blocked or unavailable numbers flashing on my caller ID. I'd pick up to hear nothing but vaguely sinister ambient noises. Footsteps crunching on gravel, distant voices murmuring but intelligibly. Once what sounded like digging and shoveling. Sometimes just heavy mouth breathing like the caller was right next to me instead of miles away. A few times I thought I could make out a word or phrase in the garble, my name, my address, but the audio was too distorted to be sure. The phone would click after a few unsettling moments, and the line would go silent. I stopped answering after the first few rings, preferring to ignore the intrusions. But the phone kept bleeding relentlessly late into the night, fraying my nerves. I couldn't fathom who would subject me to these bizarre midnight calls. Prank callers, wrong numbers. Something more sinister? The not knowing left me rattled on edge. Soon after, the knocks began. A rhythmic rapping at my front door, sometimes in the dead of night, other times mid-morning when I was home working. I'd open the door cautiously to find strangers on my doorstep, looking me up and down. "I'm here about the ad," it'd say cryptically. "What ad?" I'd reply, utterly confused. "The one on Craigslist. For services. Services? What kind of services? My mind reeled as I tried to piece together just what they were implying. All I could do was apologize for the misunderstanding and politely send it away. But the visitors persisted in increasing numbers and frequency. Young, old, male, female, all bearing the same vague intrusiveness masquerading as confusion. I started to feel like a caged animal at the zoo, gawked at through the bars. It all came to a head one morning when I opened my door to find a letter taped to the front. I tore it down with trembling fingers, a knot of dread forming in my stomach as I scanned the words. It was a print out of a Craigslist ad, complete with my name, age, phone number, and home address. But the photo was a blurry body shot, just intimate enough to be unsettling, making my skin crawl. The ad described services of an adult nature, implying I was some sort of escort or worse. Bile rose in my throat as I crumpled the paper in trembling fists. Who would create such a vile, fictitious ad? Why target me? How had they gotten my personal information? The questions throbbed like a migraine as I weighed my options. I immediately called the police to report the harassment, though my nerves made it hard to articulate the full disturbing scope. The dispatcher took down the details, but cautioned that little could be done without evidence of a concrete crime. We agreed to touch base if anything worth threatening occurred. In the meantime, I started meticulously documenting the unwanted visitors and calls, keeping a precise log with descriptions and license plate numbers when possible. I invested in a doorbell camera and motion sensor lights, hoping to deter or at least identify any nocturnal prowlers. Despite my efforts, the doorbell still rang at all hours, often multiple times a day. I refused to open for unfamiliar faces, yet still a torrent of strangers arrived, shouting lewd questions through the door about my alleged services. They slid lewd notes and photos under the door, making my skin crawl. When I didn't respond, they yelled slurs and pounded angrily on the door, testing the locks. I felt violated, exposed, and utterly helpless, like a caged animal being taunted. My nerves were frayed to the quick from the constant intrusions. I barely ate or slept, worrying what each new day would bring to my doorstep. The safety of my own home felt compromised. Frustrated by the lack of police action, I followed up insistently for weeks, presenting my meticulous documentation of the harassment. But time and again, I was met with indifference and inaction. They brushed it off as an inevitable downside of the digital age, unlikely to rise to the level of true criminality unless threats or violence ensued. No matter how I stressed the seriousness and trauma of this ongoing violation, they maintained it was essentially a nuisance suit and a waste of resources. Deflated and defeated, I could only continue the vigilance on my own. After about a month, the fervor slowly died down. The late-night calls tapered off, and the barrage of visitors became a mere trickle. My life inched back towards normal, though I knew nothing would ever be quite the same. I felt raw, exposed, jumping at every ring of the phone or rap at the door. My refuge had been invaded by unseen forces, reveling in the power to disrupt and distress. Though the chaos had calmed, the damage was irreparable. I was left fraught with frustration and paranoia, no closer to answers or justice. Try as I might to move on, that sinister episode changed me at a core level. I became obsessed with solving the mystery, scouring the dark web and trading circles for clues on who might be behind the bizarre harassment campaign. I invested in encryption software and took meticulous steps to remove myself from people's search sites in hopes of better guarding my personal information. But all my digging led only to dead ends and red herrings. Almost worse than the invasion itself was being left utterly in the dark, without resolution or retaliation. The lack of closure haunted me, and the questions eating away at my psyche. The experience left me withdrawn, suspicious of strangers and technology alike. I felt I couldn't trust anyone, convinced some unseen enemy was out there waiting to steal my identity and turn my life upside down again on a whim. I existed in a state of hypervigilance, wary of things that used to give me comfort, my phone, my computer, even my own front door. It was exhausting mentally, emotionally, to be so continually on guard. My paranoia was like a prison of my own making. But the alternative, being stupid and blind again, was even more frightening. Though it's been years now since that harrowing episode, it lingers with me still. The sense that safety is an illusion, privacy a thing of the past. That we're all just data profiles waiting to be exploited by those with sinister motives. I hardened myself in the aftermath, But beneath that cynical shell, the wounds remained tender. It was a painful reckoning, one etched deeply into my psyche. The lesson cost me dearly, but in it I found a new sense of caution and vigilance I'll never take for granted again. My innocence is lost, but my eyes are opened. For better or worse, I am forever changed. I had fantasized about renovating my outdated, cramped galley kitchen for years. The cabinets were cheap particle board from the 80s falling apart at the hinges. The laminate countertops were worn and peeling. The appliances were ancient, with the oven door handle broken and the dishwasher permanently leaving a puddle on the stained linoleum floor, no matter how many YouTube DIY fixes I attempted. I loved to cook, but prepping elaborate meals in the cramped space was impossible. After painstakingly saving up for what felt like an eternity, I finally felt financially equipped to renovate my kitchen into the sleek, spacious chef's dream I had pinned on my Pinterest inspiration board. I eagerly scoped out contractors, getting quotes for ripping out the dated cabinets, expanding the footprint, adding an island, installing top-of-the-line stainless appliances, durably luxurious quartz countertops, and eye-catching marble look backsplash. The astronomical estimates deterred me, each coming in over double what I had budgeted. I turned to Craigslist, scrolling through ads for handymen and contractors promising quality kitchen remodels at a fraction of the cost. One ad stood out, boasting beautiful photos of recently renovated mid-century modern, contemporary, and farmhouse-inspired kitchens. The contractor named him advertised affordable remodels and upgrades. His website showcased before and after photos of dated, cramped kitchens he had transformed into bright, sleek, spacious modern culinary showpieces. The site boasted rave 5-star reviews from satisfied customers praising his affordable pricing, speedy timelines, and quality craftsmanship. Excited, I reached out to schedule a consultation, eager to get started. Fahim arrived early the next morning, brimming with energy and ideas as he took measurements of my tiny galley kitchen and discussed my hopes for a contemporary farmhouse feel with more space. He pointed out areas we could knock down walls to create sightlines between the kitchen and living room, making the space feel open and airy. I was thrilled when he said he could accommodate my desired layout of a large kitchen island with barstool seating, high-end finishes, and new professional-grade appliances, all within my modest budget. The estimate he mailed after the consult came in at almost half what the other general contractors had quoted. Given the glowing online testimonials and photos of his impressive completed projects, I felt confident handing the job to Fahim. We signed a contract stating I would pay 50% up front to order the custom cabinets, countertops, and appliances needed for the remodel. In my excitement, I withdrew the hefty sum from my rapidly dwindling savings and got him a cashier's check. He promised to begin demolition shortly after the materials were delivered in the next few weeks. I could hardly contain my giddiness imagining soon having the Pinterest-worthy kitchen I had fantasized about for years. As the weeks crawled by, red flags I had overlooked began to surface. The custom cabinets I had paid for were nowhere to be seen. My unanswered calls went straight to a generic voicemail while my texts bounced back undelivered. When I drove to Fahim's listed office, I found nothing but an abandoned building front. The painful reality dawned on me that I had been scammed out of thousands in hard-earned savings by a fake contractor. Desperate, I combed through his glowing online reviews again, only to discover the names. Photos and stories were fake. Fahim had lied about his credentials and experience. I felt like such a fool for blindly trusting this stranger with an exorbitant upfront payment without doing due diligence to ensure he was legitimately licensed, bonded, and insured. In my eager rush to finally renovate my kitchen, I had ignored all the glaring warning signs and handed over my cash to a con man. I filed a police report, but they had little hope of tracking down someone clearly using a fake identity. The bank could not retrieve the stolen funds either. I had no choice but to start completely over and finding a legitimate general contractor to finish gutting, then renovating my destroyed kitchen. This meant shelling out even more money I didn't have just to make the demolished room functional again. Working with a new contractor I had thoroughly vetted was a long, slow, financially draining process. I scrutinized everything from licenses and insurance to references and reviews. I questioned each decision, upgrade, and payment wary of getting scammed again. Even though the new contractor came highly recommended from people I trusted, I still had trouble fully trusting anyone after being so thoroughly duped and robbed. After months of setbacks and delays, I finally got my beautiful farmhouse kitchen. But instead of feeling victorious, I just felt deflated gazing at the lovely space I had worked and sacrificed so hard for. It represented all the crimes done against me instead of the fresh start I had envisioned. I struggled to relax and enjoy cooking in my dream kitchen, knowing how much money had been stolen from me by a con artist likely still out there swindling other eager homeowners. I was angry at myself for letting my guard down in my zeal to finally renovate. I had become complacent flipping through contractor ads with temptingly low prices and gorgeous kitchen photos, ignoring obvious red flags. This painful, expensive debacle taught me invaluable lessons about doing copious research and vetting before handing over any money or trust to strangers. I learned to listen to my instincts instead of moving forward blinded by excitement. While I'm still trying to financially recover, the emotional scars serve as lasting reminders to be more discerning and cautious when hiring contractors. Though my kitchen remodel drained me financially, it filled me with hard-earned wisdom. I cringe remembering my foolishness. I share my cautionary tale so others don't make the same mistakes that allowed a predator to steal my savings. My kitchen may finally be renovated, but it symbolizes the importance of vigilance when dealing with seemingly great offers from strangers online. I've learned anything that seems too good to be true usually is. The most expensive things in life sometimes come without a price tag. I've always fancied myself a bit of a photography buff. As a hobbyist shooter, I love seeking out vintage cameras and photography paraphernalia at estate sales, thrift stores, wherever I can find them. There's something about the look, feel, and legacy of old film cameras that just speaks to me. So when I come across an antique Leica, a classic Nikon SLR, or even just old lenses, photo albums, or darkroom equipment, it's hard for me to leave them behind. I've amassed quite a collection over the years. A few months back, one of my weekend treasure hunts took me to a ramshackle antique mall on the outskirts of town. This place was a goldmine for the techie collector. Shelves upon shelves of vintage radios, TVs, phones, and all sorts of analog photography gear. My eyes lit up when I spotted a particularly old 35mm SLR film camera tucked in the back. Based on the styling, it seemed to be from sometime in the late 1960s or early 70s. The camera body was scratched and worn, but the mechanics seemed intact. Best of all, it had a timeless vintage appeal. I just had to have it. The antiques dealer let it go for a song, $5. Clearly having no idea of its potential value to collectors like myself. I happily handed over a $5, already envisioning displaying this new trophy on my shelf at home. After excitedly inspecting every dial, button, and switch on the vintage SLR on the drive home, I decided to take a closer look at how it functioned. Popping open the back, I was surprised to see an old roll of film still loaded inside. Now this was an interesting discovery. My curiosity kicked into overdrive, wondering what long-lost images this film might contain, if there were any exposures made previously. I was tempted to pull it out to take a look, but I knew this risked ruining the roll and any photos on it. No, this called for a more patient, careful approach. I would have the film properly developed first. Rather than develop it myself, I decided to list the camera for sale on Craigslist as is, with the mystery film included. I described the item in detail, noting the vintage styling and functional condition. Almost as an afterthought, I mentioned the undeveloped film, not knowing if it would even be a selling point. However, much to my pleasant surprise, the film roll detail attracted immediate interest. Within days, a potential buyer named John reached out by email. He introduced himself as an avid film photography buff who would love to purchase the old camera and develop the film roll himself. We went back and forth with questions and details, really hitting it off with our shared interest in analog photography. We soon struck a reasonable deal for me to sell him the vintage SLR, along with the unopened roll of film inside. John could hardly contain his excitement at the prospect of developing whatever images it contained. The following Saturday, we arranged to meet so I could hand off the camera. Upon seeing it in person, John became even more animated and eager, handling the vintage SLR with care and admiration. He pointed out specifics of the model's history and technology as we chatted. It was clear he had extensive knowledge and passion when it came to film photography equipment. We traded a few stories about favorite cameras we had owned over the years before finalizing our transaction. John explained he would head to his go-to-film development lab first thing tomorrow morning. We said our goodbyes, both curious what forgotten photographs he might uncover. A week later, I was completely blindsided when John contacted me frantically and urgently requested we meet at the local police station. He offered no details, only saying it concerned the camera and film. My mind raced with what could have prompted this as I rushed to the station. There, I found John already speaking with a detective, with photos spread across the table between them. As they slid the developed pictures over to me, I nearly became sick at the sight of the horrifying and disturbing content depicted. The photos on the film roll showed vicious assaults, lifeless bodies, and other gruesome crimes. I was speechless, utterly horrified at the nightmarish scenes captured in the images now before me. What kind of twisted mind was behind the camera for these? Suddenly, the vintage SLR I had handed off to John felt filthy and evil in my memory. I wanted no part of any of it. Of course, the detective harbored immediate suspicions towards me as the source of the camera and film. I was brought into an interrogation room where the detective grilled me intensely about every aspect of how the items came into my possession. I told my story over and over. I had simply found the camera at an antique store and knew nothing of its history. But clearly the detective assumed I must have some connection to or knowledge of the vile acts shown in the developed photos. After what felt like endless, intense questioning, the detective finally seemed to accept my account, that I had innocently purchased a vintage camera at random, with no clue about the shocking film roll loaded inside. Without concrete evidence to connect or implicate me, he had no grounds to hold me any longer, though it was clear I was still on his radar. John, who had simply hoped to indulge in innocent photography hobby, was traumatized by the entire ordeal. To unintentionally come into possession of potential evidence from heinous crimes shook him badly. This chilling discovery would undoubtedly haunt him for some time. As for me, while cleared of suspicion, the encounter still left me shaken. At word over the camera's origins and who could have been behind such violent, sadistic acts, I racked my brain, trying to figure out how an instrument of such depravity might have innocently wound up at a local antique store. I came up empty, of course. Wherever it came from, the vintage camera seemed to possess a sinister history I wanted no part of. In the end, I realized I would need to exercise far more caution when acquiring old photography equipment in the future. While most often harmless nostalgic novelty items, sometimes a camera's past is filled with darkness best left buried and forgotten. This encounter left me resolved to enjoy photography strictly on the safe, benign side of the lens. No more gambling on vintage gear and mysterious film. I'll stick to capturing life's simple pleasures with my tried and true digital camera from here on out. It was a sunny spring afternoon when I decided to list an antique oak dresser I had inherited from my grandmother on Craigslist. The curved legs and carved floral details hinted at its age and craftsmanship, but it didn't quite match the modern decor in my small apartment. I figured with a fresh coat of paint, someone could give it new life, and the extra cash from selling it would come in handy to pay some bills. I spent time staging and photographing the dresser to show it off in the best light. After uploading the pictures to Craigslist, I carefully wrote up a detailed description of its dimensions, condition, and history. I had learned from past sales posts that being thorough helps serious buyers feel confident about responding. Within just an hour of the listing going live, I received an email from a woman named Sarah who said she had been searching for an antique dresser exactly like mine for her guest bedroom renovation. She asked if she could come by that evening to take a look. I agreed and sent her my address, feeling excited about the quick response, but not thinking much more of it. Around 7 p.m., right on schedule, there was a knock at my front door. I opened it to find a woman I presumed to be Sarah standing there wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, a friendly smile on her face. After introducing herself, she gushed over how perfect the dresser was and how amazing it would look once she finished it, saying it was just what she had been envisioning. I led her inside to give her a closer look, watching intently as she carefully examined the details. She took measurements, opened all the drawers, and inspected the backside, seeming satisfied. When she asked to purchase it for the full asking price, I was thrilled but also hesitant about having a stranger in my home. However, her non-threatening demeanor put me at ease. I helped her load the heavy piece into her truck, graciously accepted the cash, and sent her on her way, feeling good about trusting my instinct. But that sense of satisfaction quickly faded about an hour later when I heard a forceful knock at my door. I was puzzled about who could be stopping by unannounced at this hour. When I opened the door, my confusion immediately turned to fear. Standing on my doorstep were Sarah and two unfamiliar, brute-looking men, their friendly facade now replaced with menacing glares. Before I could react, it pushed past me into the foyer, physically grabbing me and showing me backward when I tried to stop them. One kicked the door closed behind them, while the other held me firmly in place. My heart raced, my mind spun. I had no idea what they wanted or what they might do. When I shakily asked what they were doing, Sarah snidely responded that they planned to take anything of value, but first needed to restrain me so I couldn't call the police. With no warning, one of the men fiercely punched me in the gut, knocking the wind out of me. As I wheezed in pain, the other man wrenched my arms behind my back and dragged me into the living room. There, despite my pleas and cries, Sarah bound my wrists and ankles tightly with rope, leaving me completely immobilized on the sofa. I felt utterly helpless watching the men ransack my home, rifling through my belongings and cramming valuables into bags. Sarah stood guard, smirking cruelly at my anguish. After what seemed like an eternity, the men returned, arms full with bags of my possessions. But they weren't done yet. One man produced duct tape and sealed my mouth shut so I couldn't call for help. They conversed quietly amongst themselves before turning back to me. Sarah smugly told me they had to leave, but couldn't have me going to the police. The men then half-dragged, half-carried me to the bathroom and bound my legs with more rope before lifting me into the empty tub. I watched in horror as they turned on the faucet, icy water gushing out. The men laughed at my futile attempts to free myself as the water rose higher and higher, engulfing my lower body. They walked out, leaving me helplessly alone and terrified, the water inching toward my face. I thrashed against the ropes, but I was stuck fast. The water was bone-chillingly cold and seemed to rise agonizingly slowly. I cried out against the tape sealing my lips, but only muffled whimpers emerged. Just as the water reached my neck and I feared I would drown, bound and trapped, I heard the front door open and a familiar voice calling my name. It was my neighbor who must have noticed something amiss. Despite the tape muffling my screams, she followed the faint sounds to the bathroom and found me seconds from being fully submerged. She frantically shut off the faucet and untied me with trembling hands. I collapsed in sobs of relief and terror as she wrapped me in towels, stammering out what had happened. She called the police, who later found and arrested the thieves with my possessions. In the aftermath, I grappled with severe anxiety and trauma from the invasion and near drowning. It took months before I started feeling safe in my own home again. I was endlessly thankful to my neighbor for her life-saving intervention. But local news reported that the group had targeted other Craigslist sellers with similar violent robberies. I still shudder remembering that friendly knock at the door that precipitated a nightmarish robbery attempt. But I'm grateful to have survived the harrowing ordeal. I decided last Tuesday that it was finally time to sell my old mountain bike that's been sitting in my garage unused for the past few years. I originally bought it back when I was in high school and did a lot of bike riding around the neighborhood and on the little trails. It served me well for many years. I had fond memories of the adventures I had on that bike through my teen years. But lately it's just been gathering dust, so I figured someone else could get some good use out of it. I snapped a few pictures of the blue and silver bike and posted an ad on Craigslist. In the description, I mentioned how it was still in good mechanical shape. The gears shifted smoothly, the tires had decent tread, and I had just had it tuned up recently. It wasn't a high-end bike by any means, but it was certainly still functional. I set the asking price at $200, which I thought was fair for a solid used mountain bike. The very next morning, I received an email from a young man named James who expressed interest in the bike. He asked if it was still available and requested some additional photos from different angles, which I promptly provided. We exchanged a few more emails over the next couple days to nail down the specifics. He said he could come by after work on Thursday evening to check out in person. I agreed to the plan and gave him my address. Right on schedule Thursday afternoon, James rolled up on a bike of his own. He looked to be in his early 20s, average height and medium build, wearing jeans and a gray hoodie. He was polite enough when he introduced himself and shook my hand. I wheeled the mountain bike out from the garage to show him and pointed out some of the features while he looked it over closely. He asked if he could take it for a quick test ride around the block, to which I agreed. When James returned from his test ride 5 minutes later, he said the bike rode beautifully and he'd like to go ahead with purchasing it if everything looked good mechanically. I was pleased he didn't try to haggle on the price. We went inside and I signed over the title to him. Then he counted out $200 cash, which I pocketed. As we headed back outside, James asked if I could lend him a bike pump so he could air out the tires a bit before riding it home. That request seemed harmless enough, so I grabbed my floor pump and brought it out to him in the driveway. But as soon as I turned to head back inside, I heard a clatter behind me. James had dropped his own bike unceremoniously on the ground. When I spun back around, he was already tearing off down the street on my mountain bike, pedaling as fast as he could. The scoundrel had stolen it right from under me. I shouted angrily for him to stop, but James didn't even turn his head, so focused was he on making his getaway. For a brief moment, I considered sprinting back inside to grab my car keys so I could chase him down. But judging by the speed he was riding, combined with the winding side streets in my neighborhood, I knew he'd be long gone before I could locate him in my vehicle. It was immediately clear I'd have to try recovering my bike through other means. The first thing I did upon returning inside was to call a local police department's non-emergency number and report the theft. I gave the dispatcher a physical description of James along with the name he had given me. She took out all the details and said an officer would be in touch about filing a report. I explained I didn't have much to go on besides a very common first name, but hoped he could help track the perp down. Over the next several days, I visited every pawn shop within a 20-mile radius, figuring it was likely James would try to quickly unload the bike for some fast cash. But none of the dozen shops I checked with had any records of it being pawned. I also kept a close eye on Craigslist in case either my original ad was reposted or a new one popped up trying to sell the bike, but each day yielded no leads. Nearly a week after the incident, I finally caught a break. A buddy of mine who works at a bike shop across town gave me a call. He said a young man had just come attempting to sell them a used mountain bike matching the description of the one I had stolen. The shop declined to buy it, but did get his name, Jeremy, and phone number before he left. I immediately called the police to update them on this new information. Apparently James was not even the guy's real name, but the phone number gave them something solid to finally work with. Thanks to tracking him down through the number, the police were able to positively identify James, whose real name was Jeremy Holt. They arrested him that very evening at his apartment and recovered my bike. The next day I went down to the station and collected my property, elated to have it back. This whole ordeal was certainly a roller coaster over the past week and a half. I learned my lesson about verifying IDs before conducting transactions with strangers online, and I'll be extra cautious with any future Craigslist deals. But in the end, I'm relieved justice was served. Jeremy is facing charges for theft and fraud. And I have my beloved old mountain bike back where it belongs. Selling things online definitely carries some risks, but being smart about precautions can minimize the chances of getting ripped off. All's well that ends well, I suppose.
Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.